For Chapter 8 in your Sociology 3392 textbook, Experiments. Okay, so we talked a little bit about experiments when we talked about evaluation research, so we're going to go into them in a little bit more detail in this chapter. So, topics that are appropriate for experiments. Experiments involve taking action and observing consequences of that action. So again, this is really useful for evaluation research. We want to see if a program or policy or something along those lines is working. It's well suited for projects involving limited and well-defined concepts and propositions, so hypothesis testing. It's better suited for explanatory research rather than descriptive research. And finally, it's good for small group interactions. Okay, so types of experiments. We can, do experiments in the lab. That's done all the time. We can also do field experiments, which are carried out outside the lab. One of the more, well-known social experiments was the hotspots policing experiment, where they wanted to see if putting more cops at high crime areas would reduce the crime in those areas. And, they found out that yes, it was pretty effective in doing that. Web experiments, which are done online, and then natural experiments. These are experiments that occur outside control settings. So, a natural disaster or a political event, something that is outside the control of the researcher themselves. So a natural experiment that was done after Hurricane Katrina was looking at whether Hurricane Katrina, the displacement of people after Hurricane Katrina led to recidivism of people who had been released from incarceration. They found that if people were displaced, they were actually less likely to recidivate than people that were not displaced by Hurricane Katrina. Okay, so the purpose of the experimental design is to isolate the possible effect of an independent variable. When we're doing experiments, we call them a stimulus on a dependent variable. So members of the experimental groups are exposed to the stimulus, and those in the control group are not. So oftentimes the stimulus is a program, or maybe a prevention program or an intervention, something along those lines. So you have an experimental group that receives that program and the control group that does not, and then we compare them. So a classical experiment is something, we call this a true experiment. It's actually not very common at all in sociology and criminology research. It's more, in the natural sciences, we do a lot of classical experiments, but it's very, very, very difficult to do these when we're using, human subjects. Major components, it has an independent and the dependent variable. Again, the independent variable is a stimulus. Usually this is dichotomous, meaning they receive it yes or they don't receive it. And then a dependent variable, which is the effect or the outcome. We need two groups, experimental and control groups. So again, the experimental group is receiving the stimulus while the control group is not. And we also need pre-testing and post-testing. So we need pre-testing, meaning we're measuring that dependent variable before, and then we're giving one of the groups, the experimental group, the stimulus, and then we're measuring that dependent variable for both groups again. Okay, again, experimental group receives the stimulus and treatment, experimental group receives the stimulus and treatment, control group does not. We want these two groups to resemble each other, so they have to look similar to each other, usually by demographic, and we need random assignment. So we can't cherry pick who we want in our treatment group. We're not going to pick who we think is going to respond to the stimulus better. We need random assignment between two groups in order to be a proper experiment. Okay, so the importance of using a control group, here we have the Hawthorne effect, which is the effect of being studied on the subjects themselves. So there was an experiment done to look at whether better lighting would make factory workers more productive. So they thought, okay, we're going to, turn up the lights in this factory and see how the workers respond. So the productivity increased each time the lights were brightened. So a little bit brighter, more productive. Again, a little bit brighter, more productive. And then the experimenters wanted to know what would happen if they dimmed the lights, whether or not, the productivity would go back down. But they found that the productivity went even higher when the lights were dimmed. So they thought, well, what is going on? Well, it turns out that worker productivity wasn't an effect of the lights, but rather being watched by the researchers. So the subjects were, doing what they thought the researchers wanted them to do. So they were working a little bit harder each time the lighting got changed. Okay, so in the classical experiment, again, pre-testing and post-testing is very important. So you want to measure the dependent variable for everybody prior to administering the stimulus. And then after the stimulus has been given to the experimental group, you want to measure both those dependent variables again. And then you're going to look at the difference between the experimental and control group. If you do not have pre-testing and post-testing, you do not have a classical experiment or true experiment. Okay, so now a little example of a single blind and a double blind study. So in a single blind study, the researcher knows who the experimental and control groups are. So the subject doesn't necessarily know whether they're in the experimental or control group, but the researcher does. So the researcher knows who is getting that stimulus or treatment. In double-blind experiments, neither the researcher nor the subject knows who is in what group. So when we're doing sociology and criminology experiments, it's very, very unlikely that we're going to have a double-blind study because usually the stimulus that we're giving to somebody is some sort of program, and usually, the researcher is going to be aware of that. However, in medical research, double-blind experiments are very, very common. This is when some of the people are receiving the actual, drug, and other ones are receiving a placebo, which is just, a fake sugar pill. So again, we don't use these a lot in sociology and criminology research. It's more a feature in medical research. Okay, so how do we select participants to be part of our experiment? Well, college students are a good, group to use. They're very accessible. Often you can, get student participants to agree to be part of a study in exchange for, a couple bonus percents on an exam. So a lot of research studies, especially those in universities, are carried out using college students. So it's great that they're accessible and usually willing to be part of a study, but they're not necessarily generalizable. So often college students are younger and more educated than the general population, so we can't necessarily, depending on what the experiment is, we can't necessarily generalize it to, the population at large. Probability sampling usually isn't used in experiments. It's usually people that, volunteer to be part of them. Randomization, again, is very, very important. So you want to assign your experimental and control groups to random. You can't, pick people to be part of groups for a specific reason. It has to be random assignment. Okay. So even though we use random assignment, we also want to sometimes use match pairs. So this is very common in social research, in all research. So we might use a quota matrix where we have, characteristics that we want to match people on, and select people that are most similar to each other. So maybe we're going to look at gender, race, and age, which are probably the most, common metrics that we're matching people on. So we want people that are, similar to each other in both the experimental and control group, but then we're going to randomly assign which person to go into which group. Okay, so a lot of times in criminology and sociology, it's just not feasible to conduct a classical experiment. Usually we're not able to do it. Just what we're studying there's gonna be limits on that. So we use quasi-experimental designs. So this admits one or some of the requirements for a classical experiment while still keeping some of the other requirements. Okay, so for example, a one-shot case study. There's no control group here, and it doesn't use pre-testing, only post-testing. So for example, we look at a guy, he's working out, he's observed to be in trim shape. that doesn't really tell us that much. We can't time order the before and after. We can't, necessarily see what he looked like before if we don't know. So we would call this a quasi-experimental design. Again, it's not the best to use, but sometimes that's all we have. So for example, maybe we're going to look at some effects of COVID, but we weren't able to, include a control group because everyone, was exposed to COVID in some way, shape, or form. So maybe we didn't pretest either. We only looked at the effects afterwards. So a one group pretest post-test design. So this is where we are able to measure something before, but we don't have a control group. So an example of this might be the change of a law. Maybe a law is enacted. So if we think about changing laws around marijuana policy right now, this would be a good example of maybe a one group pretest post-test design. So we could, measure people's or look back and see the marijuana use before, marijuana was legalized in a particular state, and then we can measure that again after it was legalized, but we can't, have a control group because everybody is under that same law. So static group comparisons. So this uses experimental and control groups, but there's no pretest. So maybe you're unable to, do a pretest, but you're still able to look at that stimulus and measure the dependent variable afterwards. Okay, so experiments have a lot of different threats to validity that you need to watch out for. So there's many different threats to internal validity, so the conclusions drawn from the experimental results may not accurately reflect what went on in the experiment itself. So there's something flawed about the experiment itself. The first threat to validity is history. So events out of control of the researcher change the results. So for example, a natural disaster or a big historical event might change these results completely. If we started doing an experiment like right before COVID happened and then it continued on into COVID, it's probably, there's probably going to be some differences there in those results than if, COVID never happened. Next is maturation. This is specifically for, experiments that take place over a longer period of time. People kind of just change naturally as they get older. Next is testing. So this is what happens when people are aware that they're being, researched, basically. So the subjects act in a way that will please the researcher because, they want to help out and they know that they're being studied. So we look at the Hawthorne effect, could be an example of that. Instrumentation, different instruments used in pre and post test. Usually this is not such a concern. Hopefully we're going to be using the same instruments, maybe for some reason that, previous instruments not available, but usually researchers are going to try their hardest to measure that dependent variable using that same instrument in both the pretest and the post-test. Okay, statistical regression. So extreme scores will move closer to the mean. So if we have let's say we're giving a class a math test and everyone's score is absolutely terrible. Maybe they get a couple math lessons and then are retested and everyone does better. Well, maybe it's not really the effect of that math program. Maybe it's the fact that everyone was so terrible on that first score that pretty much there was nowhere to go but up. Selection bias. This is when the researcher picks subjects that they think will respond to treatment. So if you're not randomizing your experimental control group, this selection bias can happen. Experimental mortality. This is a case in almost every experiment that goes on for longer than maybe like an afternoon. Participants just drop out of the study for whatever reason. And those that do drop out might be different than the ones that stay in the study. Causal time order. This is when the dependent variable is measured before the independent variable and not, remeasured again after the stimulus is taken. So maybe if you're in the middle of a program and then you decide to, do that pretest measurement when the program has already started, you're not going to really get a good look at the proper effects of that program. Diffusion of treatment. So this might happen when the experimental and control groups communicate. So it's not going to be that big of an issue in every type of research study, but some particular types, maybe if they were to, let's look at our math example. Maybe the experimental group, takes this math program, and then everyone's sitting around and having lunch, and the experimental group and control group are talking to each other, and the experimental group is telling the control group, what they learned in the math class. Well, maybe, that's going to contaminate it a bit, and that control group now is exposed to at least some part of the stimulus. Compensation, so maybe the control group is provided with extra compensation. Again, maybe an issue, especially if you're giving out compensation, but this is, a way a researcher can control for this is just not give them that additional compensation. So compensation could be money, could be, an extra couple percentages of your total grade, et cetera, et cetera. Compensatory rivalry, this is when the groups try to outdo each other. Again, it's not a thing that's necessarily seen in a lot of research studies. This is just when the experimental and control groups, get competitive about getting, doing better on that math test. Demoralization. So maybe those that don't receive the stimulus might drop out because they are angry. So if we're doing this math test or math program, maybe those people that are in that control group says, hey, this experimental group is getting this free math program, like we really want it too, and we're just mad that we're, not in that experimental group, so we're just all going to drop out of the study completely. Okay, so next we have external validity. So this is the possibility that the conclusions that you find when you're doing this experiment might not be generalizable to the real world. So there's really a trade-off between internal and external validity. So when you have high internal validity is usually when it's more of a controlled environment, maybe in a lab. You have a lot of control over the variables. But then, your external validity suffers because it might not be generalizable to the real world. Whereas if you're doing a field experiment more in the real world, you're going to have better external validity, but it's going to be much harder to control those variables. So you might have decreased internal validity. So it's up to the researcher to really, play that trade-off and decide, decide to balance it as best as they can. All right, so one of the more infamous experiments in social sciences is a Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. So this was completed in the early 80s by the Minneapolis Police Department with Lawrence Sherman, who's a policing scholar, and they really wanted to see the effects of being arrested for domestic violence and whether it would make them reoffend. So when responding to domestic violence calls, officers were supposed to randomly assign the perpetrator of the domestic violence incident as to be arrested, to leave the home for 8 hours and then come back, or else mediation. So they wanted to check whether these people recidivated or committed another act of domestic violence. So 6 months afterwards, the police records were checked to see if the perpetrator recidivated, and then the victims were also interviewed every 2 weeks. So the study found that those who were arrested were significantly less likely to reoffend, so it led to a lot of mandatory arrest policies for domestic violence. So everyone thought, this study's great, we found out a lot of stuff, but then they thought, let's replicate this in different studies. So it was replicated in, I believe, 5 or 6 other studies, and they were not the same, they did not have the same findings. So there's something specifically about the Minneapolis experiment that was different than the other experiments. So what went wrong? Well, some of the officers just refused to participate. Some of the officers did not randomly assign the conditions. So they were supposed to randomly assign using a notepad, arrest, 8 hours, apart from the victim or mediation. But, they would look through that notepad and say, well, I don't like this guy, I think he needs to be arrested. So they were not randomly assigning the conditions. They thought, well, maybe we'll include a researcher for the ride-along, but it just wasn't feasible. So they weren't able to make sure the experiment was being conducted properly. So again, this is just a logistical problem of people not behaving the way that they should. Only 62% of the victims completed the follow-up interview, so they had a huge chunk of missing data there. And the victims that did not complete the follow-up interview were probably the ones that were more likely to be re-victimized, since they might be, scared of the offender and did not want to participate. So there just might be something unique about Minneapolis. So this shows the importance of, replicating studies, doing it in more than one location to make sure that that effect really is there. Hey, no. So next is a Solomon 4-group design. So the pre-testing might affect the subject as well. So in order to do so, they might desensitize this to whatever the stimulus is. So it adds control in experimental groups that skip the pre-test. So again, this is using 4 groups instead of 2, and it's just sort of an added reassurance that that stimulus is, we're looking at this true effect of the stimulus. Strengths and weaknesses of the experimental design. So we're able to isolate the experimental variables, impact over time to make sure that, it's working. We can replicate this. Again, we should replicate this in different situations, different cities, etc. Weaknesses of experimental method, the artificial laboratory settings, it's really hard to really get at that effect if it's done in a lab. Finally, ethics. Experiments typically involve deceiving subjects. So because they're intrusive, experiments open the possibility of inadvertently causing damage to subjects. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're doing an experiment.